did you become an advocate for survivors of sexual assault?
Oh my. I mean, I feel like there are two answers. There's one that's like, let me describe how I started to where I'm now, and then there's another one that's like, I have trauma.
Yeah.
So I think the I have trauma one is relatively self-explanatory. Not many people enter this work just 'cause. You kind of have to stumble into it, in a lot of ways. But when it comes to how I actually started, I was at NYU. That's my undergrad. And in my sophomore year, so it was fall 2019, they rehired a professor, and I'm going to say her name. Her name is Avital Ronell, who was found guilty under Title IX of sexually harassing her graduate advisee. And they rehired her after she was on leave. And they were like, this is fine. And she got bodyguards from public safety to walk around with her because people were really unhappy that she was there, understandably. And she got advisees back, which is the messiest part of it all. And at the time that happened, obviously the school was up in arms, and I realized that it was affecting me on a personal level because it just made me feel like NYU just like delivered a slap in the face to everybody on campus who has ever been harassed or assaulted, which is a huge number of people if you look at statistics. And I wrote an op-ed for Washington Square News, which is like the independent newspaper at NYU. And I basically just like ranted about how I was feeling in it. And then the next day and for like the following weeks, I kept getting like email after email after email after email to my professional email at WSN from people who were talking about how Title IX at NYU let them down or betrayed them in some way or protected the perpetrator, didn't even do any like steps towards any kind of restorative justice. So there was no punishment whatsoever for what occurred. And a lot of the students described retaliation against them. So it's tale as old as time. It's just another institution that lets down survivors, right? But I was shocked. I'm not from the US. We don't have Title IX. I thought, hey, there are safeguards in place. It's gotta work. And then it was basically a bucket of cold water on my head that I was like, oh, this actually doesn't work anywhere.
Right. So because you grew up in
Moscow in Russia,
Moscow.
But I'm Ukrainian.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so there was no Title IX there. Was there like an
No.
equivalent?
No.
No.
It's back home. It's a very hush-hush thing. Yeah. You don't talk about what happens behind closed doors. You don't bring shame on your family. Things like that. My family was never that way. My family, like, has been super supportive through the stuff that I've gone through. But it also has to do with my parents' general mission with raising their kids when it comes to breaking generational curses. The majority of people around me did not get the same privilege, unfortunately. But yeah, there are no safeguards. A friend of mine she's older, she's like almost 30 now, and I'm 23, almost 24. She went to the police once. She got attacked in the street. She managed to run away, and they said, come back when you're actually raped. So that encapsulates how it goes back home.
Wow. So, you're here then in the U.S., you're at NYU,
Yeah.
and, this is going on campus. How did you know that you were ready in your healing journey to share your experience and write about it in the op-ed?
Oh, I wasn't. I just had no idea. That part of my story is quite peculiar to me still. I have what's known as dissociative amnesia, which is basically something happens to you and your brain suppresses it to the point where you don't remember anything that went on, because it's like your brain's flawed but kind way of protecting you. Right? It's like dissociation in people. It's like, oh, my mind is protecting me. It's not really working, but like it's doing its best. I did not remember two of the three things that have to do with sexual violence that happened to me in my life. I mean, one of them I probably don't remember because I was 10, so like I'm tiny. The other one was completely repressed. And then Dr. Blasey Ford was testifying against Kavanaugh, and some of the things that she said kind of unlocked some stuff in my head. That was when I was a freshman. And then the whole thing kind of crumbled. I had like flashbacks, I had nightmares, the whole 9 yards. And I think I wasn't ready when I published that op-ed because I was still in the thick of it, but I was also so angry that I did it anyway. The thing is, the reason I don't think I even thought about whether I'm ready or not is because I wasn't expecting that many people to relate.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and then they did, and then it was like, oh, well, now we're here.
So by writing that, would you say that it changed kind of the course of your healing journey?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
I think a lot of what I went through had to do with isolation and keeping secrets, and being told that certain things are just not mentioned. And when all of those people basically spilled their guts and talked to me about their own experiences, it became extremely evident that not only am I not alone in any of this, but most people have dealt with this. It's not really a minority.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that opened up a path to community.
Yeah, and how does it feel for you knowing that there is that sense of community?
It sucks because
Yeah.
I wish there wasn't, because I wish less people had gone through it. It's one of those things where you do your job and you wish you were out of business.
That's a good,
Yeah.
a good analogy.
But I think it's also helpful because you kind of get energy and strength from one another.
Mm-hmm.
One day you're having a bad day and the other person picks you up, and then the next day they're having a bad day and you do the same for them. So there is a lot of reciprocity. And I think in that way, it's basically like a self-powering battery.
That's interesting. Because I feel like, when it comes to any trauma, but especially with sexual assault, it's such a personal experience.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to see, though, like the collective power of people's stories together propelling change and also kind of helping people like process and, move along their own healing journey.
I mean, I think that the majority of traumatic events people go through in their lives, they go through alone, to be honest. Like, even when let's say your family loses a parent. Yeah, you are going through it with maybe siblings if you have them, maybe your parents, like side of the family, what have you. But at the end of the day, it is still your personal grief. And so I think the majority of traumatic events go that way. If not all of them. I mean, I'm not going to say all of them because that's too broad of a generalization, but I think it's mostly about how isolating the trauma itself is versus how not unique it is, but in a good way.
Sure.
Like, yeah, your pain is unique to you, but what happened to you is also an experience that someone else most likely had.
Yeah. How do you navigate kind of those feelings of isolation and kind of the lack of linearity in a healing journey? I mean, that, it can be daunting. There's moments where you feel so overwhelmed, I imagine.
You stop being overwhelmed the more you go through it. And as probably cliche as it sounds, like through repetition, you just become desensitized. And then eventually your body and your mind learn to feel safe in a situation where you actually are safe. But I also don't really feel isolated in my experiences anymore, because I had gone through a period of like looking for support. I went to a support group for a while for survivors.
Oh, okay. How was that?
It was great. It was, I think, the most probably healing experience in this journey for me, because not only are you working with a mental health professional who's obviously there and knows how to support you and the other members of the group, but you're also with people who have experienced something so similar, and you know that group especially routine and schedule-wise, is a constant in your week. So even if you're having the worst week possible in terms of trauma triggers and things like that, you know that you will be in that space from this time to that time, and you will be safe there. So it's like a really cool thing to latch on to.
How did you get connected originally with that group?
I have a wonderful friend who lives in Texas who went to NYU as well and graduated early. She's older than me by a couple years, and she did a support group at, I think, also our school. And she basically told me that it was an incredible experience, and if I wish to, I can try. And then that was around the time where they were starting a support group for victims of sexual violence and survivors who don't identify as cisgender. And so I kind of fell into that category very neatly because I didn't want to go to a group where it's cis women, because I didn't want to, A, I don't think I can relate as much. B, I didn't want to take up the space. Same goes for cis men. And it just worked out. The timing, the advice, everything.
So when you go and, just in general, when you're talking about your experience and your trauma, I mean, that can be such a draining experience and can bring up, it makes a lot of emotions fresh and, feel new again. Are there any techniques that you have adopted that kind of help you then decompress afterwards?
I think so, but a lot of it now comes as like second nature. Like I'm now thinking about it, and I know that like whenever I have like a hard day at work, a student shares something that has happened, for example, or I think I have especially hard days when I work with like younger kids, so like first, second, third grade, because that's around the age where my first experience with sexual violence was. And it's quite visceral because it's one of those things where I can't help but think, what if this is happening to you and I don't know? And I can't protect you because you are going to go home after you're in my classroom. I think those days are really hard. And I kind of have like a little ritual for myself of what I do when I come home that helps me decompress. And as silly as it sounds, this is super niche. I don't know if it's going to work for anybody else. I play Sims.
Oh, okay. I like it. Who doesn't love Sims?
Right? And I have those families in Sims that are basically my little safe havens that I created. It's a space where nothing bad can happen because you're fully in control of everything.
Oh, I like that.
And I think that when you are a survivor, one of the things that comes up a lot is lack of control. It's a situation where not only is your body uses a weapon against you, but all of your autonomy is stripped, right? That's kind of what it's known for. And I think having something, maybe you go to the gym where you have full control of your body and you can experience it for yourself. Maybe you have a trusted partner you feel safe with, who you can be like intimate with, who, is a place where you're in control. Maybe you play Sims like me because you can control everything that happens in the game and it's a safe place.
You mentioned your students.
Yes.
And so in addition to all of the work in journalism that you've done, you also now work in sex education.
I do, yeah.
So
I moved on from journalism.
Okay.
Yes. At least for now.
Yes.
At least for now.
What has your experience been like working in sex education? How did you find yourself wanting to do that?
I have no idea. How has it been? It's been amazing. I love it. It's where I feel, I think, most at home, and like I just know what to do. The way I started was when I was a sophomore. There is this amazing organization called Peer Health Exchange. I am not sure how they operate now because things really changed after lockdowns and like the thick of pandemic. But at the time, they recruited college students. We went through training, and then we were put in high school classrooms to teach predominantly sex ed and consent, but we also taught a lot of like reproductive justice and mental health and self-advocacy and things like that. And so that's kind of how it started, because I noticed that the majority of my students, they were not as engaged listening about mental health, for example, because fortunately for my generation, it is far less taboo, and there is far more community, and there is far more access to support. It's not ideal by any means, but there is more of it. And sex ed is just lagging behind. And a lot of it is still taboo. I mean, look at Florida. It's quite literally prosecuted if you, let's say, assign your students a book that has to do with body anatomy. Like, one of the books that has been just banned in Florida is literally a book that explains human anatomy. How's that, you know? And a lot of them were quite disengaged when we talked about things that didn't have to do with sex ed. And then when we brought that into the classroom, you just saw the need for that knowledge. They had so many questions. They wanted to talk to you after class. The question box, which is like for anonymous written questions, filled up every class. And it was just different. And it kind of made me realize that, like, I see that there's a huge need for that. I also would love to do prevention instead of, like, helping people navigate the aftermath. Like, ideally, we can come to a place in the future where you prevent things from happening before you have to help people deal with the lifelong trauma of sexual violence. And I worked with a lot of organizations, and I still do. I mean, you guys, obviously. I work with Save Bay, who does peer education, which is like how I started, right? I was a college kid going into high schools and teaching high school kids. Know Your Nine for like Title IX stuff. It's all about prevention, and so that's kind of what I would like to do more of.
Sure. Is there like a specific age group that you are working with right now?
I work for a community center network, so it's basically need-based.
Okay.
And I have taught teenagers, I've taught younger kids, I have had toddlers in my class, which you can't teach because they just want to draw, and it's really sweet. But you can talk to them, and you can be like, well, hey, don't take the marker from this kid. You should ask if you can have the marker. And then if the other kid says no, you're like, don't take the marker anyway. If they said no, they said no. So there are ways to teach consent to even kids who have no idea what sex is, because it's not about sex in the first place.
That's really interesting. So you can start at such a young age of laying a framework.
Oh, 100%. I have a wonderful friend online known by the handle Survivor's Advocate. Her name's Lexi. She is a survivor herself, and she's a social worker, and she developed a book called, I think it's called Body Safety Book, and it's for really young kids, and it explains things like private parts versus public parts, or secret keeping. Like, if an adult tells you it's a secret between the two of us, no, it's not, go tell someone. Things like that. So a lot of those things can be taught to young kids in very age-appropriate ways. I mean, also consent isn't just about what happens when you have sex with someone, right? Like, it's also about respecting boundaries. It's also about general respect for people moving through the world. And those kinds of things kids need to know, because they will be interacting with one another and adults. So yeah, I think you can tailor the curriculum when you teach sex ed, and we call it health education.
Okay.
Because, I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it is.
Right. I mean, it is health.
It is health, and I mean, trauma can affect both your physical and mental well-being, like, and yeah, so I think it can be taught to any age group. You just have to tailor it.
Is there anything that you wish that parents knew? Like, if a parent is maybe hesitant to kind of start some of those conversations, thinking, oh, it isn't maybe age appropriate. Like, are there things that you wish that you could help them see differently? Yeah,
I mean, I think I got quite lucky. I wish my parents started the conversation earlier, because I think it could have protected me from quite a few things. But I also think that they were very proactive for, like, people who grew up in the Soviet Union, where it's hush hush, you don't talk about sex, kids are made in the factory type thing, right? Oh, I'm not kidding. That was an explanation we were given.
Oh my God, really?
Quite a bit, yeah.
Wow. Oh,
or also that we're found in like Cabbage Patches.
oh my gosh, that's so interesting.
Cabbage Patch Kids.
Yes.
Yeah, but so I think that it's never too early to start talking about, for example, body safety. And things along the lines of how to respect other people, how to understand what you're okay and not okay with. You can also implement it through the controlled interactions your children have, young kids have with, for example, relatives. Let's say you're at a Thanksgiving dinner and you're leaving, you're about to drive home, and I don't know, Auntie Samantha wants a hug. You can ask your kid, like, hey, do you want a hug, Auntie? Or would you rather give a high five? Or would you rather just stand by me? Mm-hmm. Give the kid that autonomy. Make them feel from a very early age that they are in charge of what happens to their body.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that you can spare them all of that kind of trauma, because there will still be really bad people in the world, or people who are misguided or uneducated, right? Mm-hmm. But it allows them the autonomy in situations where maybe they're being coerced, and they can be like, yeah, no, I'm gonna go, like, type stuff. So some things you can mitigate through education.
For families who didn't start that conversation early on, but are looking to get it started now, I mean, that can be a daunting sort of topic to approach with kids, especially, you know, teenagers in particular. They might be hesitant to listen. And do you have any recommendations for families on getting that conversation started?
For sure. I mean, it's different depending on your kid, because the devastating reality of our work is that some kids you start this conversation with when they're teenagers have suffered that kind of violence. And so I think that in many ways, before you have that conversation with your child, if you're a parent, you need to sit down with yourself and you need to internalize that it is not your fault what happened to your kid. I mean, unless you were the one who did it, which I sure hope you weren't. So in that way, you have to understand that it is not your fault. It's a flawed system. We kept this topic taboo for way too many centuries. It's not on you, but what happens from here on out, you're in control of, and your teen is in control of. And I think that with teenagers, the conversation has to be approached through largely personal experience. My mother did a brilliant job in making me feel heard when she shared her own experience. And I mean, most people have it. You can also just approach, because, I mean, teenagers might be or seem aloof or disengaged, and that's okay, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to have those conversations. You can very much be like, hey, this is important for me to tell you. I understand if you don't want to talk about it. I'm just gonna give you my speech and leave you to it. And if you want to continue the chat, you know where to find me. There's going to be no judgment. There's going to be no shame, that kind of thing.
Right, just kind of opening that dialogue.
Just leave the door always open, because your kid needs to know that you're a safe person to come to if, God forbid, something happened to them.
I feel like a lot of times with kids, you know, your parent could be saying something to you and it might seem to them that you're not listening, but really you are, and afterwards go back and reflect.
You are listening. Yeah. It's one of those things that I've encountered in my classrooms a lot with like 13, 14, 15-year-olds. They seem super disengaged. And then at the end of the class, they will be like, you mentioned this thing earlier. I have a question about it. And you're like, wait, I thought you were like completely just I thought I
had lost you.
Yeah, and I think in many, many ways, they are listening. They're also watching what you do. It's not just about what you say, it's about how you act. Do you ask them for permission with XYZ? Do you knock on their bedroom door before coming in? Do you foster a shame-free environment? Google the statistics on when, for example, in your area, kids tend to start exploring their sexuality. When your kid reaches that age, just buy condoms and be like, hey, if you ever need contraceptives, if you ever want to chat about it, let me know. I got some. Don't push it. Don't be like, hey, I bought you condoms. Here's a gift back with condoms. Because that can be very intimidating and it can feel quite pushy. It's like, wait, my mom thinks I should be going out. And yeah. But like, open the door for the conversation. Your kids are watching. They're very observant. And they are going to notice small things. They're going to notice how you model, for example, argument resolution, how you interact with your partner, how you interact with your friends. Just everything that happens in the home, I think, has to be quite intentional when it comes to respecting boundaries and showing them that they are autonomous human beings.